Please be advised that this podcast is meant for educational and informational purposes only and is in no way a replacement for legal or medical advice. The opinions contained within are solely those of the interviewers and interviewees and should be received as so. Those seeking help or advice are encouraged to obtain professional, legal, and medical services. Trigger warning. This podcast may contain explicit description of gender-based violence, including physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Listener discretion is advised. The following episode discusses sensitive topics related to gender-based violence, included but not limited to domestic abuse, sexual assault, harassment, and discrimination. If you or someone you know is affected by the topics discussed in this podcast, please know that help is available. We will provide links to support resources in the episode description. Thank you.
Hello again, everyone, to the second episode of our Hurt to Healing podcast with Yola and Anthony. Today we have a special guest. She is Yola and I's former supervisor, one of the best feminists that I know, and someone who delves into reality TV more than anyone else I could tell you. Her name is Elise Delacruz. She works at the Women's Center, and I'm going to let her kind of introduce herself from here. So who are you, Elise?
Well, that's a big question. Who am I? My name is Elise Delacruz. I am the director of our Violence Against Women Prevention Program, the assistant director at the Women's Center. I've worked in the anti-sexual violence field pretty much my entire career. So, I don't know, 15 years or so probably at this point, 13 to 15 years. Yeah, I don't know. I enjoy pop culture and identity talk, and I like to take it deep and also keep it silly. So,
yeah,
that's very true. From what we know about you, that is definitely the case. So without further ado, I just want to get kind of started on giving like a broad definition of what gender-based violence really means to you. We told our listeners that we're going to be asking this to each person just to kind of see how gender-based violence is still a working definition and it has like different connotations or experiences for each person. So what does that mean for you, Elise?
Yeah, I think for me, gender-based violence really speaks to the ways in which, I don't know, so like I like to sometimes I use a textbook, but I think for me, gender-based violence really is speaking to violence that really targets folks' sense of self, and there's a piece of control to it. And the way that that typically shows up is through sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking. But I think the piece that really makes it gender-based is I do feel like it's particularly, yes, we talk about like disproportionately who perpetrates or who is impacted by it, but I think it really sort of targets sort of folks' core sense of self and really sort of like speaks to larger pieces of oppression based particularly through folks' gender and identity, I would say.
Can you talk a little bit more about that piece that you said about how it attacks your sense of self? I'm curious about what you think more about that.
Because I think when we're talking about like gender-based violence, I think people are used to talking about like, oh yeah, it's a violation in the sense of safety, but really it shifts the way that you view yourself in the world, right? It's to view the places that makes you question what do you know is right and what is wrong, right? Like it makes you question where are safe places, who are safe people. And I think oftentimes when I talk to survivors, I always sort of echo to the piece of, in the past, that's the things that you have to work on gaining trust back. It's not necessarily always of other people, but are you able to trust yourself? Because the vast majority of folks who are assaulted, whether through sexual violence or experience stalking or intimate partner violence, domestic violence, however you want to title it, it's often in places and people where they thought they were going to be safe, where they thought they were going to be okay.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a very good point in terms of like attacking the sense of self, because I think with trauma, we do normally see that, but I think, as you mentioned, it is kind of hard to trust other people, but then above that, it is like something that's so deeply personal, and especially you've done like a lot of work with this. Is this something common that you see with the survivors that you've worked with throughout the years? Like, not to generalize, obviously everyone's experience is extremely different, but what are some of like those things that you've seen with survivors and the work that you've done with them that are like, oh, okay, this is very specific to gender-based violence?
Yeah. I always go back to, I think about when I was in high school, I was a swim instructor and a lifeguard, and my favorite class to teach were the preschoolers. And I always use this example because I think about like little kids as like us in our purest form. They're amazing at boundaries, excellent talking about their feelings, but then the way that they approach the world is like very carefree and strong. Like I have two nieces that are 3 and 6, and they are dynamic. Like my 6-year-old niece will talk to you very easily around like those are not kind words, those are not kind feelings, but she also believes like she has black girl magic and it's like actual magic that she wields, right? I see her approach the world in a sense of freedom. They're very sure about their emotions. Like both of them are sure of like themselves. Like they try new things, or if they don't want to do it, they're very clear on that. And so what I always think about in terms of like trauma is trauma disrupts that, right? Like that sense that we have, like as we get older, we lose those pieces. And so oftentimes what a lot of survivors is the self-blame, right? Like I see that very common, I should have known better. I shouldn't have gone with this person. I shouldn't have been in this relationship. I should have done all these different things is really common. I feel like there's often times folks are unsure of what happened or they're minimizing it. Like, did this really happen? The amount of times that I have folks, particularly when I'm teaching a class or doing a workshop, that folks will come up to me and say, hey, X, Y, and Z situation happened. Like, was this actually violence? Was this actual assault? Because it becomes so, we're so used to minimizing, like, this wasn't that bad. This person didn't actually mean it. They're going to be better that the next time, all these different things. Or, you know, I think about in cases of stalking, well, they just happen to be there. Maybe I'm making this up. Maybe I'm making this something bigger than it really is. I think it's really hard for a lot of survivors to just own, like, this sucked. This was terrible. This was not my fault, right? Like, I could not have prevented this, right? You can do everything, quote unquote, right, and still be the victim of gender-based violence. And I feel like that in particular is really something that's pervasive. And I think that it takes a while for folks, I think, to figure out their equilibrium post a traumatic situation, right? I think a lot of folks think if I can get back to the person that I was, I see that happen. Like, I just want to go back to the person I was before all this happened. And I think that is very complicated for a lot of survivors, particularly for survivors who have experienced violence from a very young age. Like I talk, you know, about like the preschoolers, but there are folks who, you know, experience violence, you know, from the time they were infants. And so then it becomes a sense of like, who am I outside of this violence, right? Like, who am I outside of this trauma? Like, has this corrupted every single part of who I am and my identity? Those are the things that I end up talking to survivors a lot about. And I've noticed sort of consistently.
Yeah, I actually remember when you brought that up. I remember during Empower one time, I came up to you, and this is something that I've always shared with my Empower facilitators or anytime that I interact with survivors. Is I remember I was kind of telling you, like, well, these are the things that happened, and I don't know, like, I don't think that this was that, but like, I had like this kind of hard time labeling it. And then I remember you said to me, you were like, well, there's no like check boxes that you have to like hit before you're like,
Mhm.
I'm a survivor. And I was like,
Mhm.
I just don't think it was like that severe. And then you were like, okay, so what are the check boxes and what are the things that categorize that? Like, and then once you were trying to like ask those questions, I realized I kept putting myself in this box that it was easy for me to do and it felt like necessary for me to digest it, but then it was actually like in its own way, like some sort of like repressive violence that I was doing to myself. And it's like that kind of cycle that you get stuck into that you don't think of yourself as like qualified enough to call yourself a survivor or to be worthy of like recognizing that these are just difficult things and I went through some hard stuff that actually wasn't my fault.
Yeah. And that's so common. So many people are like, I don't, and I think this, we do this for a lot of things, right? We do it in terms of like being a survivor. We do it for like mental health. Like for other people, it's fine.
Mm.
Other people should go to therapy. Other people should take medication. Other people should be kind to themselves. But me, I'm different. right? I don't deserve those things, but other people should do this. That I feel like if there's one constant that I've seen, whether it's trauma, whatever it is, it's always that like, oh no, other people deserve all this care. Other people deserve to be better. Other people deserve all these things, but my stuff is different. It doesn't actually require all of that. What is like, no, we're no different.
I was gonna say that exact point that I so often find myself giving advice that I don't take myself. And
Mhm.
and yesterday I was in your class, Elise, and we were talking about the idea of taking what you do in the small and trying to make it big, like practicing on what you want for the big picture in your small life. And that was one of the things I was thinking about was I don't I want to practice not and it's not about not giving good advice to people, but it's about internalizing that advice and turning it back on myself. And in therapy, I've something that's really helped me was like turning the camera back onto yourself, like when you're in these social interactions, especially when we're dealing with trauma and you're talking to someone, a survivor, a victim. Um, like the camera is on them and you're talking to them, all you can think about is them. But when you take a step back and like turn the camera around and think about your own violence and the way that you just talked to them about their violence, it really shifts your perspective, or at least it's seriously shifted mine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's an important piece and is like that shift. I honestly I find myself doing that with like y'all. I was saying something, I was like, "Ooh, I was literally just talking about this with my therapist." And it's like a good like self-reflection, like, no, it's true, right? Like I think it's a lot easier to see it for other folks,
Mm.
right? Because I think we don't know people as intimately as we know ourselves. And so we can see the greatness in other people. We can see the redemption in other people. We can see all these different things. But for us, we're like, oh, well. But again, it's like, what is the type of care? Or like I think about when I talk to like parents,
Mm.
what care do you want to model for your children? Like, what are you modeling for folks? Are we modeling like self-sacrifice and like exhaustion? Or are we modeling care? You know?
What
Do
do
you have
you
any? Oh, I'm sorry. You can go.
What do you think you model for other people, at least in terms of like gender-based violence and how like your experiences have shaped how you model that for others? Like what does someone looking at Elise do you think would get away from um how you model like care around gender-based violence?
Yeah. I think for me, I think I try to model it most in the way that I supervise and that recognizing that like people are people, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on and I never want to be somebody who's just like, all right, like very strict, like you got to do this. Oh, you weren't here, like you're out. You know what I'm saying? Like I try to offer folks a lot of grace and just like take the time because I think those are the things that I haven't always received. And I'm like, this is what also is really important. And I think particularly for folks like doing gender-based violence work, I see the toll that it takes.
Mm,
Like people, like I find the folks who choose to do this are I would say 99% of folks who sign up to do any type of gender-based violence work are survivors themselves or have a very close connection to someone who's a survivor. But like I think it's rare. I don't think I've met anybody who has no connection, both personally or very close to them, to some type of gender-based violence who chooses to do this work. Right. And so I think about like what is the sacrifice that folks are offering. And I always want to model like honoring that. Like I never want to be, I think that's the biggest piece is that I always want to model like I'm going to care, like I care about you as a person beyond just the labor that you're providing. Um, and so that's what I really hard for.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask a similar question, going back to the idea of turning the camera back onto yourself is, do you employ personally any strategies to do that? Like when you're supervising and you say something that, oh, like maybe I should do some more work personally on this. Like, are there any strategies that you employ to do that?
Yeah, I think giving myself grace is the biggest thing that I work on. I'm a very, I think I talk to people a lot and like I think particularly for you, y'all are so hard on yourselves. Like I should do X, Y, and Z. And I am similarly very hard on myself. And so I've been working on giving myself grace and care. Right. And like being a little bit easier on myself because I held myself to very high standards in some, like, in some capacities. Keeping my desk clean, no. But like other capacities, I hold myself to a very high standard. But I also think like giving myself grace in that like my sense of self is beyond the products that I put out, the labor that I give. And so that's something that I work on a lot.
Yeah, kind of remember and also navigate because we do live in a capitalistic society where it's like you have to constantly be in this like state of performing and just doing things. So how do you think like gender-based violence shows like on day-to-day societal stuff based on that? Like what are some ways that you see it on a day-to-day, not even just like at the Women's Center or where you work, but like throughout your like life experiences and stuff?
Yeah. I think we expect people to be okay all the time,
Mm.
right? We expect terrible things to happen in people's lives and them to still show up in the same way. And if they don't, like, then that's bad, right? Like gender-based violence shifts everything, right? It shifts the way you view the world,
Mm.
right? It shifts how you're approaching things. And I think like we have to give space for that shift. And capitalism doesn't, right? Capitalism doesn't care. It's like work, push through. Like sometimes we can stop, right? Like there are times that we need to just actually say, you know what? Everything needs to pause right now. We need to stop. We need to deal. We need to heal. Like we really just need to stop. And I think particularly for like survivors of gender-based violence, and not only like giving folks space to stop, but then also pivot and say like I can't actually do this or this isn't working, and like we need to do something completely different. We don't need to just keep pushing through and ignoring all the terrible things that are coming up. Like you have a panic attack at work, go home. Like, what do you need in this moment? Like, why do you have to keep pushing through? Like, and it doesn't mean that you're bad at your job if you have a panic attack. Like, you need space. Okay, like let's stop. Let's care for you in this moment and let's figure out what we need to do.
No, that's so true. I remember there's been times that I've shown up to work and I was like tears like falling down actively. And you're like, what are you doing here? And I was like, I'm here for my shift. And you're like, you can go home. And I was like, no, but like I need to be here. And you'll be like, okay, when you're sick, when you're going through something, you're like, you don't need to remotely do anything. You can just take that time for yourself and just be. And you're like, but obviously, like if you want to stay here, I'm here. And it was so weird for me for someone to say that. I think that was the first time I've actually heard that in a workplace where someone's like, you know what? Like, no, please leave. Like, take your time. Like, nothing you can't support, like, nothing that you will be doing right now will be productive because you can't support other people before you've supported yourself. And I think that has been something that I always look for now in the workplace, wherever I go. I'm like, okay, how do they handle instances like that? Like, how do they navigate that? Because then I think that will show in a lot of their other practices. A lot of what I've seen with gender-based violence is like it's those little things that seem like so minuscule, but that makes
Mhm.
such a big difference in holding space for other people. And then that creates the work environment where you actually give space for healing and you give space for just feeling things.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a weird situation to be in where because we're in the capitalistic society, and I keep hearing this like term results driven or like results based. And it's like,
Mm.
how do you find space for healing in a results based society? Because healing isn't always a result. Like healing is like an ongoing changing process. And and I agree, like I look for that in the workplace now too. Like how can I grow as like how can I grow this as my occupation, but how can I grow as a person here?
Mhm.
And will I have the space to make a mistake or to like shut down for a second? And will that be received well? I also wanted to share a quick anecdote about you, Elise, and you like allowing us to be not doing well in the workplace. I remember last semester I emailed you and I said, "Hey, I'm feeling really sick. I'm gonna come in for a little bit, but if I have to leave, like I might leave." And you just email back 2 words: "Be sick." Like you like don't come in, like just be
That's
sick.
so
And
cool.
I was like, oh yeah, like I guess I can just be sick. Like I guess that's okay.
Yeah, like why do we push ourselves? This is like the wildest thing. And I think the hard thing is everybody's amazing, right? And everybody can change the world and it's like meaningful. But also on the other side, the show goes on without us, right? Like, I think that sometimes it's like a weird thing where it's like, if I don't do it, if I don't show up, everything is going to collapse. That's not true, right? Like, you have to trust the people that you're around. Like, folks will pick up for you. We have to trust that, like, we are single-handedly not going to ruin everything. This is like always, this is a little bit, I'll share the one piece that I will share from my own like mental health and therapy is that my worry always is like when I came into the job, and I tell everybody, I love my job, love working at the Women's Center. Like I truly feel completely aligned. But because of it, like I'm like, I don't want to mess this up. Like that's a big thing for me. And I'm always like, and I was telling my therapist, I was like, what I worry about is that I'm going to ruin the Women's Center. I'm going to single-handedly cause the Women's Center to close. And we had to talk about, we're like, first of all, Kathleen is never going to let that happen, right? Like, I trust that I have coworkers and supervisors who are going to be like, yo, this isn't working. Like you're messing up. Like I'm not single-handedly carrying the Women's Center, right? But I think we do that so often in everything. We're like, if I don't show up, everything's gonna fall apart. And that's just not true, right? Like we have to give ourselves space for other people to like carry each other, to like support us, to do things that we need to get done. And like, okay, if things don't get done, what happens, right? Like there's always space for repair to coming back, and like the need to push ourselves is just not healthy.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to this like sense of community and sense of trust. And I think based on like my personal experiences, I think that was kind of the hardest thing after like going through certain like trauma, even specific like gender-based violence trauma. I think we talked about that sense of like safety and trust in yourself, and it just shifts basically how you think of everything. And I think for a very long time, I was in this kind of like survival mode of like, okay, I just have to keep going and there's nothing I can do about this. So let's just like ignore to the best that I can. And then it catches up with you at some point. And then it's like, okay, hold up, because that's not sustainable long term. And then you really, if you don't take the time, like you really are forced to take the time and trust in other people and trust in the community. And obviously it's very important to pick who you trust and things like that. But you can't just like developing this like hyper independence. That's something like I've struggled with, but you can't just rely on that and then keep going and think that you're going to perform as well as you would. It's like you do need every single piece of the puzzle to make something so grand as to what you want to make and to actually make that difference. Like that sense of community is so important in this like healing, but and also just how you present yourself and calming down those anxieties of like, I actually am going to screw everything up, and just kind of blaming yourself. It's kind of similar to like the victim blaming that you end up doing, and just really like trusting that to the core that somehow you're this like awful person that's just going to screw things up.
Yeah.
I think the community point is a really good point, and especially the sense of trust. Like I had this experience of like this survival mode experience throughout my life as well, and especially like being in survival mode with the trauma that I experienced, but then also um, like growing up not wealthy, not we weren't in poverty, but we were somewhere in the middle of that, and there was like this survival kind of thing that we were going through, um, and COVID was actually a huge part of like this healing for me. And as funny as it sounds, I did find a really good sense of community through COVID, and that was because like I think I did a lot of learning about myself, and through doing that, I kind of left or started to leave that survival mindset, and that kind of allowed me to accept being in a community, and accepting the love from other people, with more knowledge, knowing that I may be worthy of that love and that I can love these other people. And yes, we weren't seeing people in person, but you're still talking to your friends, and the friends that don't offer you that sense of community are usually the ones that fall out of your life, and the ones that do are the ones that stayed through that. So as funny as it sounds, COVID was huge for me in developing a sense of community through myself, but then also through the people that stayed.
Yeah, I feel like it slowed things down. Like in our
Yeah,
society, it slowed so much down that you then actually had the time and space to be like, okay, hold up, I've actually just been on this survival mode, performing, showing up every day. Like we talked about how showing up, even when you can't show up, that just keeps taking like sense of self and taking that time away from yourself. So I think COVID slowed those down to realize, okay, hold up, like it really brought things up that weren't working, and things just got like significantly worse, but they kind of had to get better essentially.
And that kind of goes back to the point we were just talking about, how it could be really beneficial to sit and slow down our these ever busy lives. And obviously, COVID was a terrible thing for the world, but um, like it did give everyone an opportunity to slow down and self reflect and heal a little bit. And like you said, things did get bad, but then they got better. And I think it speaks to how beneficial just slowing down for a second would be if we had something like that in our current society.
Yeah, people are just used to, particularly survivors are used to operating in crisis mode, right? And it can be scary sometimes to like not operate out of crisis mode. Like, what does life look like if I'm not like going from one crisis to the other, right?
Mhm.
Folks, I think for myself is I'm somebody like when I was a advocate, I hated doing hospital calls, right? Like I hated, like, yeah, it just wasn't my favorite part where I would go with survivors and sit with them in the hospital while they're having the evidence collection kit. And I think I hated it because I hated the unknown, right? Like you never knew what you were like walking into. And so I'm like, all right, how do I prepare for this? But one thing that made me good at it is that I get very focused in a crisis. Like I can be like, okay, like literally if something we're gonna focus, what is the next step? And I'm able to like lock in and do like that. But while that is helpful, that's not, also I can't operate in that space all the time, right? Like our bodies know how to operate at a crisis because sometimes there are crises. But the way that trauma does is it disrupts and makes us think that everything is a crisis, that every single day is a crisis. And then if I slow down, the crisis is going to get worse, right? Like I can't depend on community. Like we have to know that there are people we can depend on and we don't have to operate in crisis mode, that there actually isn't like a bear waiting outside of our door any moment to attack us.
And it
Yeah.
gets to a point where you're actually more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
You're much more comfortable in crisis than in safety, and
Mm-hmm.
you almost look for it. You're like, how like can I pinpoint that I'm safe when there are no things trying to get you right now? Like there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing there, but you're like, but how am I safe? And you have to prove it to
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, it's like feeling normal in that. And something that I was thinking about when you were talking about that is you're like, okay, I get very focused. Like when I walk into a space, I'm just like focused and I go into this like, what's the next step mode? And that's something that I've noticed with myself, especially like when I was in Empower and I was interacting with a lot of survivors, I would just kind of go in this like work mode. And then I had a really hard time with because a big part of what I work on and what I've told and like have worked on like as a survivor has been okay, this vulnerability. And it's like, like be kind, show yourself grace, like compassion, hold space for yourself. But then I noticed that I kind of really struggled in like being vulnerable in these spaces when my go-to was immediately just like, okay, focus and be. And then I was like, well, and I remember asking very often, like, well, how can I be vulnerable and then still just like be there for other people when it was just like so hard to find that balance. Like, do you have any advice for people that like you might want to share? I know you were very helpful to me during the time, so just wondering for our listeners.
Yeah, it's hard. Like, I think vulnerability and presence are really hard to do, right? Because I think to even think about it in a way, to be very present is to be vulnerable,
Mhm.
right? So to step out of crisis mode if you can, right? Because we're not always aware that we're doing it, but to step out of crisis mode also is telling ourselves that we have to make ourselves vulnerable to attack, whatever that attack is. And that is scary, right? I think sometimes it's really important to understand that one, there are levels, right? Like vulnerability doesn't mean like you have to lay your body down on like train tracks, but like vulnerability means like I can be real and be like, I'm not having a good day today. Or I can be like, like just being real, taking in, allowing folks to care for you is vulnerability, right? Allowing community to be there and support for you is vulnerability. And so I think um it takes practice. And so you can't always expect healing or this to happen in an instant, right? You practice in small ways. And so if you know somebody who knows that you get like very hyper focused but that also means that you're not really taking in like everything around you. Sometimes it's around like using like the grounding technique of just being like, all right, I'm going to notice things around me, right? Like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 5 things I can see. I always mess up the order, but it's not, the order isn't important as you doing this, right? 5 things that you can see, 4 things you can hear, what can you smell, what you can taste, but like just taking in that moment so you can also begin to remind yourself like, I'm okay, like I'm safe, right? And then also, I think it's equally important to remind yourself is that if things go wrong, I have the skills to handle it.
Mm.
Like, if things go wrong, I can handle it. Like, if things fall apart, I'll be all right. I can rebound.
To shift gears for a second, you started out in the Audre Lorde Project in New York City. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
Yeah.
And then the Sexual Assault Coalition, the Women's Center, and we're curious, and our listeners are curious. What is something that you wish you knew about this work or gender-based violence in general before you started? If you could talk to yourself 25 years ago, what would you tell yourself? What would you tell yourself to expect?
I don't know. I first of all to expect to do this work. Like this was never part of my plan. Like I tell everybody this, like this is not work that I was like, yes, I'm gonna go into. I graduated my graduate program at the height of the '08 recession. I could not find a job for 2 years, right? Like it was at a time I applied to one job that I had like sort of like an in connection to, and the person that was my connector was talking to somebody at the organization, and they're like, within the first hour, they got like 500 applicants to like this position I applied to. Like, this is the level, and I'm coming in with no work experience, these 2 degrees, which mean nothing, right? And so the way that I kind of got into the Audre Lorde Project is just I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and I love Audre Lorde, and I was like, oh, what are they doing? And so I helped with them, just like connecting folks with resources. And it was like a volunteer thing that I just went, and they were really an amazing community organizing center for like basically queer folks of color. And I was like, oh, this is great. And then my first position as a sexual assault crisis advocate, I was particularly an LGBT advocate. And true story, how I found the job, my mom actually saw it first. And she's like, hey, they're hiring for some like LGBT something, you're gay, you should apply. Literally. Like this was not like my, oh yeah, I want to work in anti-sexual violence. No, I needed a job. Now, mind you, I've been doing like little sexual violence, gender-based violence stuff like amongst my friends. I remember in my um this one documentary, Know the Rape documentary by Aisha Shahida Simmons, who I love her. And when I was in undergrad, I was the vice president of our Black Student Union, and I like worked with, I'm trying to think if we partnered with like the feminist group, and we took folks down to see a screening of it when I was in undergrad. And then similarly, I bought the movie, and when I was in grad school, I made all my like classmates sit together and we watched the documentary. I was like, this is really important. So like I've been doing work, like this has always been an interest in me, but this was not what I thought I was gonna do. I don't know what I wanted to do. I just needed a job. And I was like, I've been raised around survivors. Like I know how to talk about this stuff. And like that's sort of how I got into it. So what would I tell myself is like, get ready. Like know this is what you're coming into. And go to therapy earlier. I think that's a big piece because that's really important. Like start start about 10 years earlier than you did.
Yeah. That's so funny. That's so real. Like, and I think that's what happens a lot of the time. I don't think anyone just wakes up and it's like, yes, this is it. It's like sometimes things just have this weird way of aligning, and then you feel seen in the work that you're doing, and
Mhm.
suddenly you're the person that you wish you had 10 years ago, and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, like I'll keep going with this for a bit and see where this takes me. And I know you mentioned when you first like came to the Women's Center that you had been doing like the on-call and like just kind of responding to that. How was that something that like shifted for you? Like, what was it that when you came to the Women's Center, you were like, okay, this is still like you're still working with survivors essentially, but how is that different for you than what you were doing previously?
Yeah, well, I had a little bit of so I had a break when I went from the on-call position, I went to the Alliance, Connecticut Alliance on Sexual Violence, and I was their training and technical assistance coordinator for 8 years. And so that I didn't have to do any more crisis work. But I would go out and do trainings all across the state around sexual violence. And so you can't do sexual violence trainings and not do crisis work, because people are going to come up to you after and be like, oh my God, I was just assaulted, or was this actual sexual violence? And I was talking to people on how to do it. So, and then even working at the coalition where we didn't necessarily do direct service, but people would call the office and be like, what do I need? So I think I was used to, I felt like that was a good transition to coming into the Women's Center, where like, yes, I do some crisis intervention work, but that's not necessarily something that I'm going to be doing every day. It's like whenever somebody shows up, I think that was important because like I'm good at doing like the crisis piece, but I also know like the way that my like that's not really something that I want to be doing full time. Like my best friend is a therapist, and I'm like, I don't think I have the capacity to do what you do every single day and hold that every single day, right? But what I do, what I am really good at is like I can talk about sexual violence all day, right? Like, and not to say it doesn't impact me, because some stories just cut through everything and you're just like, oh my God, like this is a lot. But I'm very comfortable talking about sexual violence, talking about violence, and being like, maybe it's the Aries in me that I'm like, we're gonna talk about this thing. I'm gonna be in your face, like we're gonna say rape, we're gonna say sexual assault, like we're gonna name the things that are actually happening. And so I feel like that was a good, that's a good fit for me, and being here at the Women's Center allows me to do that.
Okay. We talk about triggers, or we talked about triggers a lot in our first episode, and we talked about how they're different for everyone. And we shared some of our strategies that we employ when we feel triggered. I talked about journaling. I talked about going on walks. I embarrassingly shared that I speak out loud on my walks and just almost journal out loud. And we wanted to ask, just for our listeners and for us, what are some of your strategies that you employ when you feel that way?
I feel like for me, in the moment, I'm always going to take deep breaths. Like for me, where I feel, when I begin to feel stress, it's always in my chest. It's always in my like voice. And so the first thing that I'm always going to do is start taking deep breaths. So I may be walking and I'm like, let's take a deep breath. I'm gonna just hold it in my chest because that's where I feel like needs the oxygen. Those are always like, that's sort of my first step that I'm always gonna do. And then the moment after, I'm big for a distraction because I'm in my head a lot. So like, I'm gonna go watch something trashy. I'm gonna read something trashy. This is what I tell everybody. Like when I started doing this work, I stopped watching Law and Order SVU. Like I, for the most part, don't really consume anything gender-based violence related on my off time.
That's
Like when
something
I'm
that
at
Yola
work,
and I have talked about. And
yeah,
stopping watching SVU.
yeah, you have to, it's too much. Because then it's like, not only am I taking in more trauma, but then it's like, I'm also critiquing because I'm like, this is really problematic. Like, that's not actually how this works. That's actually victim
Yes.
blaming. And
Yes.
so, no, I'm going to read trashy romance novels about aliens falling in love with humans or shapeshifters falling in love with each other. And the bad guys are always going to win. The good folks are always gonna, the bad guys are always gonna lose. The good folks are always gonna win, and like that's gonna be it. And I lose myself in this fantasy of like, what's the world going to look like, right? Like where things always work out at the end. I need my guaranteed happily ever afters.
Mhm.
So those are my like go-tos.
Do you have any trashy show or book recommendations that we can distract ourselves with?
Oh, I'm like, there are levels to the trash that I'm willing to share. Some pieces are just between me and my Kindle, and nobody else will ever know that I read that. Um, what I don't know, because I don't know how I felt about the ending to that, like the second book. But I just read The Fourth Wing that everybody had been talking about.
I've
I
heard.
actually really enjoyed like the first one in particular. Like it kind of gave me what I needed. Um, what I actually just read? I just read, and it's not as trashy. Because like again, this is what I'm willing to share. I think The Poison Heart, that was a nice little sci-fi fantasy book. Honestly, I've been reading more lately and I've been watching less TV. The only thing I have been watching, because again, I need something easy, is Avatar. Like, and the movie's been coming out, and I had watched some of it the before, and so I was like, well, let me start the show, like to see, everybody says it's good, but I need like easy stuff. But Love Island's always a good time.
Love Island is
Fair.
the best one, because there's nothing, I don't know what it is. There's nothing about like everything that they do, you just don't feel like this bad person for judging it. Like they'll say like, and then the accent one, the UK one is the one I watch. The accent makes it
That's the
so
best one.
better, and it's like everything that they say automatically is like just like fun. I'm like, oh.
Yes.
And then I can be like, oh, this is so silly. I'm like, why would you say this? But then somehow, and then so much of it is like staged. But I'm like, this just feels so far away from like reality that it's like I can completely just focus on this and forget everything else.
I
Like,
think the accents make it the best part in the
oh,
UK
the
version. Like I am obsessed with all the UK accents, like all the variations I didn't even know existed. Like,
Yeah.
give me some new slang. Like, I can't do accents, but like I just love listening to them.
best. Same, same.
I
Uh,
lose myself in basketball, and that's what
Yeah.
works for me.
That's true. And that's the thing, like that's so important because different things work for different people. Like sometimes like I will tell people like, oh yeah, I'll watch trashy TV, and then they're like, that actually makes me more angry because it's just like so trashy. And I'm like, oh, okay, like I'm like, that's fine. I was like, that's just like, the one thing that helps me because I'm the same way that it's like when I end up watching things, everything once you start doing gender-based violence work, you do notice that it's like everywhere. So
Mhm.
that, especially in shows, like even if I'm watching, like I used to love watching shows about um like drugs or just like how like the prison system sucks, and then I was like, okay, I actually need to take a break because I would get so angry and I would get
Mhm.
so hopeless, and then I would be like, everything that they're doing is wrong. And I was like,
Yeah.
this is like, why is the world even like, I was like, what am I doing? Like me, one person at the Women's Center, and the research that I'm doing, I'm like, this matters not like none at all.
Yeah.
When we have all these like bigger problems, and then it became like so hard to then just sit there and enjoy that, because then I'm so living in my head of thinking, well, how can I actually like dismantle this, and what is it that I can do about this? And then I'm already doing that in my major and in my work, and it's just it was so hard. It was
Yeah, no,
impossible.
I can't do it. Like I tell everyone, I stopped when I got out of grad school. I was like, I don't want to read anything that's going to challenge my worldview. Like, and the problem is it's very hard for me to go back. Like
Yeah.
now it's so hard for me to read like nonfiction, but like give me a good trashy romance. Literally the other night, I was like exhausted on what was it, like Wednesday or yeah, because I decided to stay up to midnight to finish this like trashy books, like romance series. But I was like, oh, my Kindle says 4 hours. It's 7 o'clock. Let's see if I can finish it before I go to bed. I was exhausted the next day. But like, give me like a nonfiction book. I'm like, oh, it's gonna be rough.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I actually think that um, I think that distraction or distracting yourself when feeling triggered is so underutilized because I think that there's so much discourse about what's healthy, quote unquote, and all of the strategies like the breathing and the journaling, and we do all of those things. But I think that like distracting yourself is has become like I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but like it's become a bad thing. And it's like
Yeah.
no, like sometimes it's really helpful to just like lose yourself in something else for a second. And sometimes that thing, like that basketball game for me, is like it's almost just like a buffer, so I can look at this while I'm still kind of thinking about what I'm
Mhm.
thinking about, and it just like mediates it for me. But I don't like the fact that distraction has become such a bad thing. Like sometimes
Yeah.
you just need to like be taken away. Like take me away from
Yeah.
that.
There's a reason why people disassociate. Like there's a
Yeah.
reason why our bodies go to that because our bodies and our brains know that sometime you cannot be present in this moment. Now, of course, like you don't want to tell folks like disassociate all the time, but I think I remember reading something or heard her talk, my great love, Adrienne Marie Brown, like where she was talking about like disassociation is like a superpower sometimes, right? Like that is really helpful because sometimes we can't handle it in the moment, right? And like I find sometimes a distraction, like I need to distract, I need to like the heightened emotions around whatever it was needs to go down. And then I can come back and like think around like, all right, what happened? Like what happened here? How did I get to this? But you can't always do that when you're in the moment.
Yeah.
Like when you're in the moment trying to be like, okay, what's no. Sometimes you need to get out of there and then you come back, you're like, all right, how am I gonna approach this next time? But like our bodies know what we need.
Yeah, I think uh, kind of what you both were saying. My therapist one time was telling me, she's like, well, just distract yourself in the moment, because I was like, okay, well, these things are coming up and I'm like, I'm getting so anxious. And it was like everything that I've learned in therapy just goes out the window because I'm so anxious to even just like function. And she's like, okay, so why don't you just like distract yourself in that moment until like it passes and then come back to it. And I was like, well, isn't distraction this like bad thing? I was like, we're literally getting told that like, oh, distracting, like suppressing. And I think everything in a healthy dose, obviously, don't just
Hmm.
distracting yourself. I think that's the whole point of the like, okay, don't just always distract yourself, take time to like feel, but everything in a balance. Just like, yeah, don't just like always keep feeling things at all times. Just like sometimes like your head is not the nicest place to be. So it's just like, why spend time there? Why force yourself to be in that space?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like you might need like a little break so then your head has time to become a nicer place. And I was like, wait, that's so true. Because I was like, sometimes my head is like the main thing, like that I'm like, oh my
Hmm.
God, I've actually just like not stepped outside of my brain for 1 second today. And then the moment I do that, everything shifts. I'm like, oh, okay, now I
Yeah.
can breathe and now like the world is okay and I can live here. Like
Yeah. Think about like what do you need? Are you taking care of yourself? I was telling somebody, like I was driving into work overwhelmed, frustrated, like, oh my God, everything's terrible. And then I got breakfast. And then I was like, you know what? The world is easier now. Right? Like sometimes we get so caught up that we're like, did I eat? How much sleep did I get? Right? Like, and then you do these things and you're like, oh, I can handle things now. Oh, because you're hungry. Like you're thirsty, but you get so caught up in your head around, I have to single-handedly fix the world. Like, did you eat? Did you play today? Right? Like, this is, I heard somebody, I think it's this woman, Crystal from the Read, where she was saying something. I think she's like, she's in training to be a therapist. I think our therapist said, like, you sometimes have to parent yourself. Like, if you were a 6-year-old, what would you make sure this 6-year-old had? Whereas like you would make sure they ate, they had balanced nutrition, they rested, but you also make sure they played. Like, are you so focused on I have to grind that you didn't like just play? Like, when was the last time that you just had fun?
There have been so many times where you've gotten me where you like I'll come into the women's center and you're like, did you eat? Did you sleep? And I'm like,
Y'all
you got
don't
me.
eat.
You got me. You got me.
Listen, the amount of times that I'm having a conversation with somebody at like 4 or 5 o'clock and they're like, oh, I had a bagel. It's
mhm.
4 o'clock. Like, that's all you've eaten today? Like, eat something.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
just
and I
struggle
think that
sometimes.
brings us to our like last kind of question that we had for you, and obviously share anything else you want to afterwards, but these were just the main ones we had. Was like, what is like an advice that you'd want to give to someone that's either currently like experiencing gender-based violence or someone that's like working in the field, like or both, like it can be to either or, like sometimes they overlap. So as you said, most of the people that end up doing that work have had some sort of experience with gender-based violence. So what's like one advice that if you had to give one, like what would it be?
Yeah, I think often it overlaps. There's so much. But I think the biggest piece is for folks to know that you deserve to feel good and to really like own that at like the simplest thing and think about it like you deserve to feel good. And so evaluate every single thing in your life with that understanding. Like, I deserve to feel good. Is this relationship, this friend, this job, this food, this show, whatever it is, making me feel good? Right. And then if it's not, like, what's getting in the way of that? And so, and what help do you think about what help do you need to do to feel good? And we're not going to feel good, 100% of the time. And that's okay. But like, ultimately, we deserve to actually feel good.
Mm.
I love that. That's
Yeah, that's so
something that I
nice.
have a hard time keeping in mind, actually.
Yeah.
And also something that I tell everyone else in my life. So you deserve to feel
Hmm.
good. Um, okay.
Absolutely. Like, why do we deserve to be in pain?
Yeah,
Right?
I think it sounds like so simple. Like you said that, and I was like, oh, like that just like spoke to parts of me, and that's when I knew that it was so important because I was like, yeah, I don't tell myself that enough. Like, and every time, and then because I have made it such a point, like my friend will be like, oh yeah, like even Anthony sometimes, like he'll be like, like. Yeah, I'm just gonna watch basketball. Like, I don't feel like doing work right now. I'm like, you deserve to feel good. I'm like, yes, Anthony. Like, and it's sometimes that's all it takes, like someone validating that. Like, is so nice, but it's so important to end up doing that for yourself to then be able to like I'm in charge of my own life and I
Mhm.
can make the decision and this decision is good for me and I'm the only one that can decide that. Like no one else can decide what's good for me or not in this moment. Like, and
Yeah,
yeah, thank you, Elise. That was great.
Yeah,
no
thank you.
problem.
I'm sure everyone will appreciate that.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, well, before we say goodbye, I wanted to ask, is there anything you wanted to shout out? Anything that you're loving right now? Anything that you think that other people should check out?
I don't know.
Or something you're hating right now, if you want to do that.
Yeah.
That's
I
okay.
hate lots of things. I think, what am I enjoying right now? I don't know. That new Beyonce country song has been stuck in my head like
Mm,
all day yesterday. And I'm typically not a country person, but Beyonce country makes me like question it. Um,
there.
yeah, so I think that's what I've been enjoying. I don't know. I'm really diving back into trying to get back into my like sci-fi, like particularly like black sci-fi and fantasy books. So there's a couple books that I'm excited that I'm ready to just dive in and read. So I think that's what I've really been loving.
Oh,
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much for being on this podcast. I also want to thank you for being a great supervisor for a year and a half, a great teacher, just a great person to have in my life. And yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
yeah, Elise, thank you. I also thank you both for being like in this and just taking the time to talk about these things, and especially early in the morning. Like that's not
Yeah.
always the easiest thing, but I really appreciate like all the example that you've set, Elise, and I think everything that you talked about in the podcast really embodies how you are as a person and how you are in the workplace. And that's just honestly like the best feeling to have and to know that it's not just when you're like underpaid time that this is how people are. Like this is just genuinely who you are as a person. And I've always known that and it just keeps showing up and I really appreciate that because you really do hold the space for people. And I know that sometimes you might not have had that space held for you like you mentioned, but I think you do such a good job of taking that and transforming it into something so beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you both. Y'all are making me work on accepting compliments. So I'm gonna just say thank you.
You deserve them.
Yeah, they deserve to feel good.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All
All
right. All
right.
right, Elise. Thank you so
All
much.
right.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Y'all enjoy your
everyone.
day and your weekend. All right.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
as
You
well.
too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.